Hey folks, it's Kevin Cox here, and welcome back to Oyster-ology. Over the past couple of months, Oyster-ology has been a little quiet. I've spent that time wading into new corners of the Oysterverse, and now I'm back with Season 3, and honestly, I can't quite believe we're here already. This season, I'm heading into new territory, new oyster reefs, new stories, new controversies, new cultures. I'll be talking with not only some familiar faces, but with many people you may never have heard of. People quietly shaping their own space in this bivalve world every single day. I'm diving deeper into stories about oyster farming, restoration, shucking, science, food, environmental challenges, and the complicated relationships between human beings and the waters that feed us. So whether you're a grower, a shucker, a chef, a scientist, or just someone who feels that magic little tingle when an oyster shell opens in front of you, welcome back. And follow Oyster-ology wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss a thing. Because Season 3 of Oyster-ology starts now.
Oyster shucking draws a certain type of person. Are all oyster shuckers neurodivergent in some way? Maybe we all have ADHD. Maybe we just have to see what's in the next oyster. You know, when you're shucking a box of oysters and it's on, and each one you open, it's like it's more perfect than the one before it. I live for that.
Welcome to Oyster-ology, a podcast about oysters, aquaculture, and everything from spat to shuck. I'm your host and the food walker, Kevin Cox. Here at Oyster-ology, I meet many people who work with oysters. And once in a while, I meet people like my guest today, Jason Woodside, who seem to almost live inside the oyster. A two-time Canadian shucking champion, knife maker, oyster educator, and founder of Shucker Magazine, Jason has spent decades fully immersed in oyster culture, not just as food, but as craft, identity, and history. And he's most deeply rooted in the oyster-centric province of Prince Edward Island, Canada. In our wide-ranging conversation today, we get into the hidden world of professional shuckers, its mentorship culture, its fellowship, its fierce but friendly competitiveness, and its deep respect for the animal that holds it all together. We also talk about what makes PEI oysters iconic, the creation of the Banjo Oyster Knife, and the MSX crisis hitting PEI farms right now, with some growers losing almost 100% of a 4-year crop. But more than anything, our conversation is about people. The growers, shuckers, harvesters, and storytellers who quietly shape oyster culture while trying to keep something authentic alive. Jason calls himself the oyster whisperer. He says oysters tell him stories, and after spending some time with him today, you'll understand exactly what he means. So grab your favorite shucking knife and follow me to one of Canada's most celebrated coasts as we talk about how one oyster bar changed the oyster world, why PEI oysters became globally iconic, the hidden culture of the professional shucker, the devastating MSX crisis, the skateboard wheel that became a knife, whether you really need to sharpen your oyster knife, and what it means to truly listen to an oyster, with champion shucker, bladesmith, and oyster philosopher Jason Woodside. Jason Woodside, welcome to Oyster-ology. It is so great to have you here as a guest. I've been watching you through various forums for a long time, and you're a fascinating guy, and I'm really excited to learn more about what you do and your world, because the way I see you from a distance is you're kind of this remarkable bridge between the world of PEI oysters and aquaculture in general, and oyster tool making and writing and sharing information with Shucker Mag and other forums and competitive shucking. I mean, you kind of do it all. And I'm really excited to learn your story. So welcome.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm really happy to be here. It's very flattering to be invited on to your show.
What I really would like to begin with is understanding a little bit about you and what brought you into this oyster world that you're in today.
To do a very quick bio, essentially, I was born in Toronto and my parents are from PEI. And we summered in PEI every year, and PEI was home. And so I just grew up thinking PEI was home and Toronto is just where we lived. And when I was a teenager, my parents retired. We moved back home to PEI. I went to high school in PEI. And then I wanted to become a chef. I was like really into tourism. Funny thing about PEI is like there's a high school course here, tourism and hospitality. And when I took that, my teacher really opened my eyes to what we had on PEI. And I decided I wanted to become a chef, and I wanted to go back to Toronto to do that. And I missed my friends and stuff. And so I went back to Toronto, and I was working in my cousin's husband's restaurant. I was 18 years old, had just graduated the summer before. And he was a pro shucker, and he worked at Rodney's for years. So this is Adam Cahoon, who through affiliation, I ended up in the Swan restaurant aspiring to be a chef, but I didn't get into culinary school. And I was working in the kitchen washing dishes. And then I was like shucking oysters, because he was like, you can shuck oysters, right? I got to shuck oysters for the kitchen, for the cooked oyster dishes. And I was like, yeah, of course, no problem. But I'd only seen my mom shuck oysters. I had never shucked oysters. So very quickly, he's like, you don't know how to shuck oysters. And this guy was Ontario champion at the time, and I didn't know any of this stuff, right? And I got really into shucking oysters, though. I really liked it, and I started doing it. And then he needed a couple times, like I didn't really realize that he had oyster catering going on. And so I ended up going oyster catering a few times and getting paid really well and having a really fun time and thinking, gosh, there might be something to this. So then he was going on and on about the Ontario Championships was coming up, and he made a point. He was like, if you want to shuck oysters and be an oyster shucker, you got to come see Rodney's, right? So he took me under his wing because I showed initiative. And when I ended up at Rodney's for my first oyster festival there, 18 years old, didn't have any idea this world existed. Like right away, I thought, this is like a skateboarding contest. This is like what it must be like to go to X Games, like back in the day. And I was like, this is cool. And I immediately felt community. He was introducing me to all these larger than life characters. And I was like just enamored. And everyone had a style and everyone had a thing going on. And Rodney Clark was there in full regalia, just dressed up in whatever his costume was that year. I honestly don't remember. It was just like this crazy time. It was a band, music, and beer, and it was crazy. So I was like, that's it. This is my life now. This is all I want to do. So I got really into shucking oysters, and I was catering oyster events and learning from the best. And one thing Adam did that nobody does is he got all of these old pros to come and teach me. He got John Bill, Greg Murphy. These were left-handed Canadian champions. I'm left-handed. Adam's not left-handed, so he had trouble teaching me left-handed because he could only teach me so well as a right-hander. So you want to get good, we got to get these guys, right? So those guys came down, they taught me. I learned from all the best in the business. He sent everyone to shuck with me. And I'm talking like gigs and stuff too. He'd match me up with people like, you two go do this gig. And he'd be like, you listen and you pay attention. So I got really good at shucking oysters. And then by 2004, I'd won my first championships, which was the Canadian Championships of all contests to win. So then it just went from there. That's kind of how it got started. I just got into it because I was really into hospitality and tourism and hosting and events and being like part beer rep and part catering chef by being an oyster shucker and oyster salesman. And I just got hooked on the culture of it.
I've heard a lot about Rodney's from a lot of different people, and Rodney's seems to be like the spawning ground for great oyster people and great oyster shuckers. Is that kind of your feeling of Rodney's? Is it sort of that institution that breeds great oyster people?
I have a whole history, but I'll tell you this. You know why that is, though? The reason is because Rodney Clark had this gift to be able to inspire people to want to be really great shuckers, to know the product, to learn the regions, and to like express themselves through the oyster to the people. And that is the magic. Rodney Clark could do that.
Now, if you spend enough time in the oyster world, eventually somebody mentions Rodney's Oyster House in Toronto, one of the foundational oyster institutions in Canada. Founded in the 1980s by PEI-born oysterman, the late Rodney Clark, the restaurant helped introduce an entire generation of Canadians to serious oyster culture, raw bar dining, and East Coast shellfish traditions. But Rodney's became more than just a restaurant. It was kind of a boot camp, clubhouse, and rite of passage training ground for oyster shuckers across Canada. And honestly, a lot of today's oyster culture and its top professionals trace back through those doors.
And to this day, they're still doing it. You know, there was very little oyster scene happening in Toronto. And then Rodney comes along in 1988, and then he starts taking the shuckers that work for him at the oyster bar out to PEI, and they're going to the contests, and he's taking them to visit growers, and they're spending time at the beach eating oysters, watching the river, doing all kinds of cool stuff. So he really nurtured that culture of that core group of guys and gals too. And then from 98 to 08, you have this expansion area. And this expansion era is when all these people from Rodney's went off and did their own thing. So you can sort of see how it all grew from that one kernel.
I'm very interested in the culture of shuckers, especially the competitive shucking world. Because like you said, your first experience was sort of like going to the X Games. And I've talked to a number of different shuckers, and there seems to be this underlying kind of subculture. How would you describe the shuckers world?
My buddy Johnny McConaughey says it best, right? He says, if the guy wants to shuck oysters, let him shuck. And what I mean is that oyster shucking draws a certain type of person. And this is not uncommon, whether it's a niche sport or just certain things attract certain people and certain people are good at it. Why? I can't say. Are all oyster shuckers neurodivergent in some way? Maybe we all have ADHD. Maybe some of us feel that we have to open the oysters because no one else can do it properly. Maybe we just have to see what's in the next oyster. You know, when you're shucking a box of oysters and it's on and it's like the best oysters you ever saw, just that one box and that one batch, right? And each one you open, it's like it's more perfect than the one before it.
Yeah.
I live for that. That's really what I live for. Like, I just want to open the next perfect oyster, honestly. And then when I make that plate of 12, and if I have the opportunity to shuck that plate of 12 and put it in front of the guests and say, here's your perfect plate of oysters, then I live for that too. That's really what it's about.
Now, how do you feel if you shuck that perfect plate of oysters and you bring it to the guest, and it's one of these guests that really doesn't care and doesn't pay attention to the quality of the work that you've done and of the animal that they're about to eat? And, you know, they're talking to other people and ignoring it and just shoveling down. How does that make you feel as somebody who's really put a lot of effort into making the perfect plate?
It's frustrated me over the years, but in my old age, I've come to feel that as long as the guest is eating oysters, I don't care. You know what I mean? Like people say, oh, you put sauce on the oyster. I don't care. You're buying a $50 pre-appetizer. Eat it however you want. If you don't care to know the nuances between the three types I've put on the plate, I don't care. Like, you know, it's your plate of oysters. You can enjoy it however you like. It makes me feel good when the guest appreciates and has questions, and there might be a minute to just glean them some kind of insight into why the oysters. I live for that too.
Sure.
But the reality is we shuck oysters and we serve oysters and we don't judge.
Right. Do oyster shuckers judge one another as they're shucking? You ever look over your shoulder on the side and say, that guy's really doing a crappy job, or not as good as mine, or something like that?
It's really hard not to go to a place and determine the capability of the shucker quickly. Like, it's some restaurant in another city I've never been to go there and see that it's not up to the level of me and some of my friends. I just note it. I'm like, yeah, well, you know, everyone has to come from somewhere, right? You might have a place that serves oysters, has no house pro. It's just like a few people that sort of do the shifts shucking the oysters, and no one's pushing them to learn more or to get better, because you only get better shucking oysters with other oyster shuckers who are really good. And then the advent of like podcasts and online information is all super, super new. Like the whole social media movement of oysters, of being able to say like, look at this oyster party we're at right now, and look at this guy shucking oysters, or here we're on an oyster farm or whatever, that didn't exist. So you just had to learn on your own, and you didn't have anyone to tell except for the people you were shucking oysters for. But it's really changed, and it's become quite universal. And because of this, everyone wants the story. They want the magic. Every type of oysters needs to have a story, and it needs to have a flavor profile. And those flavor profiles aren't necessarily consistent. They're not static. Like, you're not going to pick up whatever specific brand of oyster every time and say it tastes exactly like this.
No.
Everyone wants that feeling that you get from being involved. And there's a lot of information out there, but a lot of it is also just regurgitated and it's almost out of date. People say, well, PEI, the gold medal 1900 Paris expedition, the legend of the Malpeque gold, as I like to call that story, right? It's a great legend. But I'm just saying, it doesn't matter because PEI has changed so much, the oysters wouldn't taste the same anyway. It'd be a different oyster now.
Okay, so Prince Edward Island, or PEI, is an island province off Canada's east coast, sitting out in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's relatively remote, roughly a 2-hour flight from Boston to Toronto, though it feels worlds away culturally. It's considered one of the premier oyster-growing regions in Canada, probably rivaled in reputation only by the oyster waters of British Columbia. Protected by bays, cold, clean water, and tidal estuaries, PEI oysters are legendary, often mentioned among the finest in North America. When I think of oysters, especially in North America, PEI sort of stands out as this hallowed ground for really outstanding, delicious, cold, almost crisp, uber fresh oysters. Tell me a little bit about PEI. Can you describe it in broad general terms and why the oysters tend to be considered so good from that region?
This is my favorite story to tell, honestly. Okay, imagine this. PEI, it was like a series of hills surrounded by a big marsh, and over time, as the Gulf of St. Lawrence filled with water, PEI was partially submerged again. What that means is all those little river valleys and stuff filled with water, gently and delicately. So there's barrier sand hills and stuff, right? And the way the tides continue to push the sand up and continue to keep those sand hills there provided essentially a bunch of little bathtubs for oyster populations to spawn and be protected. PEI has Permian red bed bedrock. It's very high in iron. That's why it's red, because it oxidizes when exposed to oxygen. So PEI is red. Okay, now, you need iron for sea plants to photosynthesize in the water, and oysters eat sea plants and algae and microalgae and all that. So as PEI just naturally has erosion and sedimentation, you have higher concentration of iron in the water, meaning you have boosted photosynthesis compared to a bay on the mainland where it's all granite around it. But what makes PEI unique is because of that iron, the oysters are really well fed. And they're conditioned to be out of water for a period, or without food, I should say, because when the ice is in and the sun is low, there's no photosynthesis really, right? So that's really it. It's those two factors that just created a great oyster. It has a long shelf life and it's really full and plump, which contributes to that long shelf life.
That's so interesting. Now, is the Malpeque still considered the gold standard of PEI oysters, or has that changed because obviously the Malpeque has changed?
Well, it changed ever since the advent of modern aquaculture. What happened was there were no oysters for a couple of decades, basically. And then the war broke out, and then the war was over. And then you have PEI in the 1950s saying, okay, we want tourism. It's time to get the economic machine running. Oysters are back online now after decades of being unavailable. So let's really push the Malpeque oyster. So they really, really pushed that. And I think that's what cemented the modern oyster industry, at least in Toronto, because the guys Rodney was selling oysters to, see how it all comes back to Rodney?
Yes, it does.
The guys Rodney was selling oysters to in 1988 would have been kids on vacation in the 50s and 60s who came to PEI with their parents, and they had PEI oysters on the coast, right? And then they went back to Toronto, and then maybe sometimes they would see Malpeque oysters at a hotel, restaurant, or some fancy place. So that's where I think that started, was that marketing campaign, 50s and 60s, PEI Oysters, tourism, all that. And I think it was called Canada's Garden Province. The majority of oysters from PEI were shipped to the States, to large markets straight down the seaboard to Boston and that, because guess what? Those guys came on vacation here too.
Right. Is there much traditional oyster growing going on now, or has it shifted to off-bottom aquaculture?
It's pretty much all off-bottom aquaculture. Now, of course, a lot of oysters still get harvested off of the public beds, but if you look at the scale of aquaculture leases on PEI, there are so many aquaculture sites compared to public leases. So it's pretty much all shifted since 2000.
It sounds like that's changed the culture of modern aquaculture and oyster production in PEI. Have you seen a lot of change in the culture in PEI with oysters?
With modern aquaculture, you can only have so many oysters in the water at a time. There's maximum number of animals you can put in a place before they're competing with each other for food. But I don't know how many people actually know that, as opposed to just put in whatever, he puts 200 oysters per bag, I'm just going to do the same. And so really good grower will actually pay attention and try to adjust according to density.
Do you find that there is much tension in PEI between traditional bottom growers or harvesters as opposed to more modern off-bottom aquaculture people?
It's a very interesting dynamic, and it spans generations, really. I mean, it all goes back to a history lesson. There's a lot of history that people don't know, and people watching social media about, the next bling, right? There's a lot of bling and glitz and look at me and oysters and whatever, but there's zero substance behind that.
The whole social media bling factor that's happening. Would you say that PEI oysters are kind of becoming seen as a special luxury brand because of that bling, because seeing all the social media, they really are held in high esteem? What's your view on that?
I think it's hype. And I think it's us. I think me and my buddies helped do that. You know what I mean? Like, there were all these other oysters, but Malpeque was the one, because it all came back to that childhood memory thing for those old dudes, those fat cats with the money and
reliving their childhood memories.
They really were. And honestly, I think it was just the perfect combination of a lot of PEI oysters available. They were really good. They had a long shelf life. They just had everything going for them. And people liked other oysters, but not as much as the Malpeques, as the PEI. And that super consistency is just something you can't beat.
Yeah. There's so much I want to talk to you about, but I don't believe that you can really talk about PEI oysters without talking at least a little bit about what's going on today with MSX and with Dermo in PEI. Tell me a little bit about the situation, and what is MSX and what is Dermo?
Each one is a different marine microorganism, and essentially they both are responsible for the disease of oysters. So Dermo is Perkinsus marinus is the name of the microorganism, and when oysters are affected by it, they tend to become very weak and the bodies tend to become very, very soft. And it's only affecting an incredibly small amount of PEI oysters right now. So the prevalence is pretty much all MSX, which is this other microorganism. And I've been told that it causes inflammation of the oyster, preventing it from feeding or preventing respiration. But what I know for sure is that it weakens the oyster. So it's definitely not feeding. I look at the oyster, it's weak, it doesn't look fed. You know when you look at an oyster and it's fatty because it's full of glycogen? MSX infected oyster isn't necessarily that. It's a bit runny and yeah, it's fine, but you can eat it. It doesn't pose a health risk to humans. You can't get sick from eating an MSX infected oyster, but you're also not that likely to eat one. Like the oysters that get it tend to die. And the processors and the people who are growing and packing oysters, well, they're culling those ones out, and then they're shipping the rest.
So as a consumer of oysters, MSX and Dermo does not affect humans. It doesn't make people sick, even though it may be hurting the oysters. It's harmless to humans as far as we know. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. And there's been a lot of misinformation about it, too. And our government has been very open about what's been going on. The first year you see a couple of dead oysters, this year, mass mortalities. You might have heard, like in Western PEI, some growers experienced total loss. 100% of their crop is gone.
Wow.
$1.5 million.
Wow.
Right? Yeah, gone. Some people will be bankrupt and out of their house in 4 or 5 months from right now. So that's the level we're talking about. And then other places, the MSX isn't so bad. And it's not across the island evenly. The oysters coming out of some parts of PEI, you'd never know there was a problem.
It sounds absolutely devastating when you hear somebody say, oh, the farmer lost 80% or some huge number like that. But what that really means, if I understand it, is not just that this season is going to be a bad season. How long does it take for an oyster in PEI typically to grow from spat to market size? Because if you lose all of your oysters, the effect is a multi-year devastation, right?
Absolutely, yes. And that's a great point to bring up. People never think about this. It's 4-year crop cycle on PEI.
Okay.
So now your 4 years of work are gone, and your subsequent crops that were coming up behind that one are gone. Right. So you might have seen articles or in the news, because you're in tune. They valued the oyster business. They said it's a $27 million industry on PEI. But that's incredibly wrong because it's a 4-year crop cycle. So you take that 27 million, you multiply that by 4, then you start adding on all the other stuff. Does that include the oysters that are shucked and served in restaurants on PEI? Because that increases more. Does that include the people in Toronto, like Rodney's Oyster House, who are serving oysters? Are their sales included in that $27 million? Because all of a sudden, you start doing the math, and we're looking at more like $500 million industry.
Fascinating. Okay, I want to reemphasize Jason's point here because it's very important that everybody understand this. MSX and Dermo, while harmful to oyster populations, are not harmful to humans. These are oyster diseases, not human diseases. They can weaken or even kill oysters, and they create major ecological and economic impacts for fisheries and aquaculture, but they pose no known health risk to people eating oysters. So if you love oysters, this isn't something that should scare you away from enjoying them. In fact, this is the best time to eat more oysters than you've eaten in the past and support the industry while also, making your palate very happy. So don't shy away from them. Just get out there and eat more oysters. So what do you think is going to happen in PEI with respect to MSX? Is it going to bounce back? Is there some way to treat it or fight it?
It'll bounce back for sure. PEI oysters have been here a long time, and this isn't our first rodeo. And by the way, my family coming here in 1770, people whose families are from PEI are descendant of pioneers.
Right.
Multi-generations of hard life, clearing fields, living on salt fish and pork fat. You know what I mean?
Right.
Oyster shuckers like me and my buddies, we take real pride in what we do. But we don't do anything near as cool as the guys and gals who work on the water and the farmers. And so they're not just going to back down. But here's the unfortunate thing, right? Like I said, there's people who cannot weather this. So there are real challenges. Who's going to continue to grow oysters? Definitely the larger companies can absorb some of this and keep it going. And they want to see these small farms continue too, right? They need those people. Those people grow the oysters that, you can't grow all the oysters yourself. You need people to grow oysters for you too.
How is the government response in Canada toward this? Because as you alluded to earlier, the government has made PEI oysters a high priority in terms of its economic base and also its culture.
Well, they have released or offered some supports for people, and some growers can take advantage of some of these. I guess the short answer is that they're trying their best. There isn't a solution that works for everybody because everybody has a very different demographic, whether you're a public fisher, a large grower, a small grower. And the wild fishers want to start a shell recycling program, which is super important, and we're going to need it to restock anyway. So getting them out there, cleaning up some oyster beds, collecting oyster shells, and doing some real hardtack work to reestablish those natural oyster reefs, that's paramount right now. So we're working to try and get something happening there with those folks.
Yeah. So one of the things that I find fascinating about you, Jason, is not just your knowledge, but your ability and willingness to share that knowledge with other people. And that leads me to your creation of Shucker Magazine. Tell me a little bit about Shucker. Is it Shucker Magazine? Let's start with the name and then go from there.
It's Shucker Magazine, but I like Shucker Mag because it sounds cool, and maybe I'll change it to that. It started out, I was just trying to create articles about that stuff that people don't talk about shucking oysters. The behind the scenes stuff. You know, we have our own language and we have our own beliefs and we have our own standards that we uphold. Like guys I shuck with, they got huge standards. If they see people shucking oysters that aren't nice, they'll say something about it. If you're shucking oysters and you're putting them on the internet and you're saying, look at us and look at this, it better look good and you better know what you're talking about is really kind of what we're getting at. So that's my angle. I want to tell these stories, but it's genuine. It's the hidden world, and that's what it's about. Taking these stories, like there's all this knowledge from these people, and one day we won't all be here. People come and go from this industry, you know, people like Rodney Clark pass on, and everything they knew, where is it now? So I thought maybe Shucker Mag would actually become a hub for shuckers who want to tell a story. And this is still my hope. If people started submitting articles that they want to tell, I would love to share. And so now I think we're finally getting to that point. And if people want to really know the truth, if people want the genuine story, they'll read it. And if people just want to continue with the glitz and the glam and the video and the whatever stuff, then whatever, we're not that.
Are you just online or are you also print?
I'm just online right now, but I would love to have a print version, and I'm going to look into that. I'm thinking something about the size of a comic book, actually.
How do you track the stats for your readership and following and your distribution?
Honestly, the short answer is I don't. I just get it out and I see if people like it. But obviously, I've learned that just because people don't click like on it doesn't mean that they don't like it or haven't watched it.
And the principal focus is shuckers and the shucker world, but it sounds like you're going beyond that into broader issues like MSX and that sort of thing. How would you describe the scope of Shucker Mag?
The idea is to try and inform shuckers who have come into the shucker world in the social media era in the last 5 to 10 years, but especially the last 5 years. And it's almost like a way to ground them in the culture. And, you know, nobody is bigger than the culture of oysters. We're all in it together. And it's the same with shuckers. Oyster shucking existed before you got here. So I know you're new and excited about it, but, you know, really hoping to show you where you come from so that you'll carry that forward.
What stories are missing that need to be told?
It's kind of like the deep insights into shucker culture, the person serving the oysters, the stories, the ideas. It comes back to your question that said, what's the difference between a great shucker and a fast shucker? So this is why Shucker Mag exists, because there's a lot of people who can shuck oysters fast. They're not necessarily doing it well, and there's more to serving oysters than just shucking them. Otherwise, we would just shuck them back in the kitchen, like so many people did before. My point is that to create an all-round shucker and to bring everybody in our community up and lift all those boats on the rising tide, I think the strategy has to be, what information are you prioritizing to your customers? You know, you can talk about the oysters, but if somebody comes up to me and they genuinely want to know, and you can tell by the way they ask, the question is, what do you, the customer, genuinely want to know about oysters? And I will happily tell you.
What do you do when you have one of those customers who genuinely wants to know and has so many questions that just wants to keep asking you as you're trying to move on to the next table or customer or plate?
It's adorable. And it's like you see the excitement and it's hard not to want to stay. That's a total thing. And I'll admit, I get hung up on that. So when people are genuinely curious, I'm super excited. I want to inform this person because they genuinely don't know and they're going to take what I tell them somewhere else. And it has to be accurate and true and genuine.
So I want to go back to Banjo knives. When you decided to create the Banjo knife, what problem were you trying to solve? I mean, I think most great inventions are to solve an existing situation. What was your thought when you invented it?
So ever since I first started shucking, I started modifying my knives. And so Patrick McMurray had made his own knives, and I thought, man, that's so cool that he makes his own knives and they're super custom and ergonomic and all that. So that was a huge motivator for me. I was like, well, I want to do that too, you know? But then something interesting happened. I started doing oyster shucking classes, and these are just people who are private citizens and they want to learn how to shuck so they can impress their friends at their dinner party. Now, some people can use tools and some people don't have aptitudes for tools. And you're trying to teach somebody to push and twist, and the knife is wiggling every which way. And I've seen people stick it in their hand. I've seen people stick it in their arm. Like, it's a mess. People just struggling, shaking to like hold the knife. And I'm like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so, well, shorter blade, something easier to hold on to. Okay. So I tried all kinds of different designs that I made. And then I'm not even kidding. In the end, I honestly don't quite remember how the idea came to me, but it has something to do with the documentary Dogtown and Z-Boys. Okay.
Dogtown.
It's a skateboarding.
That sounds familiar, yes.
And I was looking at the skateboard wheel. And then for a joke, I was like, hey, maybe I'll make an oyster knife with a skateboard wheel for a handle, and I'll send it to one of those guys as a tribute. You know what I mean? Like, hey, I made this oyster knife because you inspired me, blah, blah, blah. And it was like, it would just be a skateboard wheel with a blade in it. And that's where the banjo came from. It's a skateboard wheel. I went to the skate shop, bought a pack of wheels, drilled a hole in it, jammed a blade in it, and that was the first one. And then from there, it just evolved. So the idea behind it, the reason that it works, is it solves that problem of the leverage. So for a beginner who's never shucked oysters before, my hand is in a really straight position. I can push and twist.
It's almost like you're pointing at the oyster with your index finger, but that's actually the knife blade.
That's right. And so now you've got all that control right there in the palm of your hand with enough to twist on. And now the act of pushing and twisting is actually easier because you're engaging less muscles in your arm.
The size of the oyster shell, is that a factor in terms of the appropriate length of the blade of the knife?
The banjo is actually designed for cultured oysters because predominantly the oysters we shuck now are cultured oysters, and that knife is perfect for those oysters. It's perfect for a cocktail or a choice oyster, hands down. You get into a heavier shelled Gulf Coast Texas oyster, then the banjo isn't really made for that. My reasoning was that most likely the people using this knife won't be exposed to those gnarlier, more exotic oysters.
The question I've often had is, you get an oyster knife and it hasn't been sharpened. It has a little bit of a ground edge on it, but not much. A typical person who wants to shuck oysters, should they be sharpening their knives or should they just rely on whatever edge the manufacturer created?
That's a great question. It is. The reality is you buy a brand new knife, you look at it, it looks good. You turn it sideways. You can see it's squared off a bit at the tip.
Right.
You just need to barely touch up that tip, just so it'll wiggle between the shells. You see, if it's too blunt, then what happens is you can't wiggle effectively between the shells to get enough shell bite. So if the blade is just the perfect shape, it'll wiggle in nice into that material at the hinge, which is called the umbra. And then you twist and pop. But if it's too blunt, you're not going to feel that bite on the shell. And it actually, in my opinion, just like a chef would tell you with a chef's knife, if it's not sharp, it's dangerous.
Sure.
It doesn't have to be razor sharp, but it's sharp enough that it'll just scrape that adductor from the top or bottom shell.
Is there an advantage to table shucking over hand shucking or vice versa?
Yes. Okay, here's the thing. Hand shucking is faster, for sure. And all the top pros shuck in hand, pretty much. There are exceptions, I know, but for the most part, they pick it up, shuck it, put it down. Now, I feel it's safer to table shuck because the table offers the support. You have to push against the knife hand with the hand that's holding the oyster, but the table pushes back for you.
Do you want to retain as much of the liquor as you can so that you can preserve that briny flavor when you first take a slurp?
The actual secret is that there's plenty of liquor inside the oyster that will come out again anyway. You'll see it starts to fill up a little bit again. But for me, it's more about making a mess. When you're shucking oysters in someone's $5 million house, you don't want shell and oyster liquor on his expensive Persian rugs.
That's a very good point.
And I speak from experience. I've seen this. So that's why I keep an immaculate oyster shucking station. The thing about table shucking, too, especially for a gig shucker, is it's cleaner. I have a tray. My oyster block is in the tray. I shuck. The liquor spills off of said board into the tray, and then periodically I just pick it up and dump it in my garbage. So I think for the sake of, cleanliness and presentation, table shucking looks great. But if you're at a festival shucking with 5 guys all weekend hammering them out, you go air.
What makes a great shucking knife?
The knife that feels comfortable in hand is the one you will have confidence with. But there's certain things you have to consider, like a Victorinox or a Dexter Russell knife. The one advantage to that is it's super durable and it's pretty much indestructible. But there are drawbacks. Those poly plastic handles like that are super dense and hard on your hand. The blades are very, very rigid, so you tend to be putting in a lot of force on the knife. A knife with a bit of a flexible blade and a wooden handle is a bit more absorbing of that force. And so it's kind of like the difference between driving a sports car and driving a luxury sedan. And now you have comfort behind you. It's absorbing some of the impact of the strain of shucking oysters. The knife actually plays a significant role in that. And that's why if you ask me, what's my personal favorite knife? Well, it's got a pretty high flex blade because I'm going for the kink in the armor. I'm looking for the jinx in the shell. I'm not using brute force to overpower the oyster. Each one is like picking a lock for me.
That's really a great description. How does somebody get a banjo knife?
So I've got them in my Etsy shop and I sell them online there, and they're also on my Square site. But the majority of banjos actually get sold to my wholesale customers. Some are seafood retailers, others are oyster purveyors. And you'll see them in a few gift shops, places that don't even sell oysters, but it's PEI, the cruise ships are there, and someone will go into the gift shop not realizing now they have to get the oyster knife that says PEI for the oyster lover they know because it's the thing they saw while they were here, right?
Right. What keeps you passionate about what you do after all of these years of doing it?
It's probably the community.
Yeah.
Is it the oyster? Yeah, because I don't shuck many oysters during the wintertime here on PEI because there's just not a lot going on. So I get the wintertime blues. It's like, I just want to shuck some oysters. I just want to hang out with people and talk about oysters. And luckily I can. Just being able to connect with somebody else about this shared passion that, that helps. But definitely getting my hands on oysters helps too. And usually it's like some kind of a seminar and then getting there, getting the oysters set up and shucking the first one. And it's like, people they call me different things like oyster expert, but I don't like that word expert so much. And so what really are you? What's your title? Well, professional shucker or, top shucker. I don't know. But one thing I know is that I would call myself the oyster whisperer. I'm an oyster whisperer because the oysters tell me stories. Okay. And so this goes back to that connection. What actually keeps me going? Is it the community? Absolutely. Is it the fact that I make oyster knives, and even if I didn't shuck oysters, at least I would still be connected to the oyster industry? Well, that's very comforting and reassuring. But the truth is, it doesn't matter what oysters I'm shucking. I can look at them and they tell me about themselves.
Really?
Yes. A great example is if you've seen one cultured oyster, you've kind of seen them all. You know characteristics. So then you start looking at oysters from different regions and you're like, oh, I'll bet you that's a cultured oyster because look at the shell characteristics, So once you start to recognize things, then each oyster, similarity or differences, either or, and you start to pick up on them. And then when I shuck oysters, even if I'm shucking by myself, I don't even have anyone to talk to. I'm at some gig and the people don't want to talk to me. The music is loud, it's dark, it's pump out the oysters, right? And then, so I just talk to the oysters and I just kind of have little conversations with them in my mind. I look at the meat density and I'm like, oh, what was the rain like? Or what was the weather like when you were harvested? And I look at the shipping and then I can actually look at the weather at that place and I can confirm, So then you start to put stuff together, and then the oysters start to really like expose themselves to me in a way. And I can just see them on this other level, like from almost a molecular level, the meat, the shell, the shape, the flavor, the smell, the look, the color, all of it. It all fits into this one thing. And that's why people eat oysters, because it connects them to that place and that time.
Wow, I don't know a better description than what you just gave. I wanted to ask you a question, and maybe you've already answered it, and that is really, what do oysters mean to you beyond food?
Oh, wow. You know, like something about the relationship between the Mi'kmaq people on PEI and the oyster is like super, super deep history stuff. I'm pretty sure to some degree or another they worshipped the oyster in a way. It was the ocean's bounty that replenished itself if you respected it. And it was a nourishing thing. And it can teach you all of these different lessons about humility and just about acceptance and about overcoming and persevering, especially, you know, just whatever the weather, that oyster is there. The shell is a great example of the life it's lived. So that's what it means to me. The oyster, I think, in all reality, is one of the oldest foods human beings have eaten. Since the time people went down to the shore and saw birds picking the meat out of the rocks and said, what the heck is that, right? I think that we humans have been so deeply connected to oysters, but somehow it's been lost. And all communities used to be so coastal, and now there's inland communities removed from the sea. And so what they really mean to me is just this deep intergenerational thousands of years history of eating and living with these creatures.
Wow. I just love that. Oyster culture, the oyster world, I'll let you define it however you choose. What do you hope it looks like in, let's say, 20 years?
I really hope that we see more responsibility at the shore level. And I don't mean on the part of the fishers. I mean, I want to see people really looking at the environment and making decisions about, like, do we really need this coastal development here? Or do we really need this aquaculture farm to survive? I want people to really look at what the future of food security means on this continent, especially, and say, shouldn't we protect the places that produce the food that we eat so that we don't have to import food from other places? Shouldn't people just, you know, have a little bit of accountability and responsibility to inform themselves or to listen to people talk about the things that really, really matter? And oysters are just one of these things that really, really matter more than anything. And, you know, do oysters have to be a luxury item? I mean, I really wish they weren't, because there's something to me about opulence for the sake of opulence that just doesn't compute for me. I'm a bit more practical, I guess. And so I don't want to see oysters for sale for $6 a piece. To me, that's not a victory. The victory is being able to produce oysters at a sustainable scale that gets them to the diner, in the restaurant, or at the oyster bar at a fair price and a great value. Like, the whole demographic has changed. It really bothers me to think of like buck-a-shuck or the feed trough oyster style, right? Like, oh, it's buck-a-shuck oysters. We're ordering 100 for the table, right? Okay, I'm going to rant here for a minute, all right? So you want to sit at the table, order 100 oysters, which to me is a bit gluttony. I don't know why anyone would want 100 of anything, right? But I should be happy. You're eating oysters, okay? But you're cheapening the thing that I do and that I care about. That farmer grew that oyster for 4 years so that it could be shucked for $1 and put on your plate, and not necessarily shucked well. It's a bit disrespectful in a way. I mean, I know there's businesses built on this, but it doesn't do the oyster any justice to make it look like a discount item. Right. Now, when I shuck, Kevin, if I'm shucking buck-a-shuck oysters, I'm shucking way more volume of oysters for less money. What self-respecting shucker who has pride and loves what they do is going to promote shucking more oysters for less money? You're cheapening our craft. You're diluting what we do.
It just makes such total sense, both from an emotional and practical perspective, but also from a business perspective. But my biggest kind of thing against buck a shuck concepts is that if you go there and it's, yeah, let's order 100 oysters. They're only $1. Who cares? Let's just get as many as we can and eat them all. I believe that there's a loss of appreciation of that oyster, of each individual oyster. People are just sort of wolfing them down, slurping them, talking, not paying any attention to this animal that, like you said, this farmer spent 4 years nurturing and growing, and then the shucker took great care to make it as well shucked as it can be. And when you just have a big pile of cheapo oysters, you don't give a shit. You just slurp them down. And to me, that's kind of opportunity lost.
I think there's a time and place for a feed trough oyster event, but I feel it should be more at a ticketed all-you-can-eat oyster event where you pay a quality price for quality oysters and there's no limit on them.
Yeah. Well, Jason, what's next for you? Got any new things you're about to start doing or revealing?
The answer is yes. I have new products coming that are, one of them is like game changer. And I can't say anything about it. I got a new line of knives coming out, though, that are super fun and exciting, and I can't tell too much about it. But in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing a little bit of trailer dropping. I'm going to be showing what the new product is. But I got something coming, man. I can't even say. Every service shucker is going to be like, thank you so much. We needed this. This is the next thing people need, and they didn't know they needed.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, truly. Finding a need and filling the need is the key to success. Well, Jason, thank you so much for all of this time. I really appreciate your being my guest on Oysterology and just kind of showing who you are in this oyster world, because you're not just somebody who knows a lot about oysters and can shuck good oysters. You've got an energy and a passion about this whole oyster world that I think is uncanny, and it's pretty remarkable. So thank you so much for sharing some of that with us.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me, Kevin. I really appreciate you and the great work that you do.
That's it for this episode of Oysterology. Thanks so much to my guest, Jason Woodside. Listening to Jason describe an oyster, you start to realize that what's sitting in that shell is not just seafood. It's tides, geology, storms, cold winters, generations of labor, and an entire coastal culture trying to survive modern pressures without losing its soul. Jason doesn't just shuck oysters, he reads them, he listens to them, and he's devoted a good chunk of his life to translating what they have to say. Maybe that's the deeper takeaway here, that in a world driven by speed and spectacle, oyster culture is, at its best, still rooted in stewardship, respect for the craft, respect for the animal, and respect for the people who bring them to us. Pay close enough attention, and oysters don't just tell you about themselves, they tell you something about ourselves as well. Links to Banjo Oyster Knife and everything else Jason mentioned are in the show notes along with a full transcript, so be sure to check it out. And if you enjoyed this episode of Oysterology, please follow, rate, and review us wherever you listen. It really helps other oyster lovers and curious food people discover the show. And as a parting reminder from Jason,
oysters are just one of these things that really, really matter.
Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to join us again next time when we pry open the shell of another interesting oysterology topic.